Welcome to our Sunday afternoon broadcast on Doctrine of Christ and Real Mormonism channels. Our dual broadcast each Sunday afternoon. I'm Dustin Grady. With me is Josh Choate. Today we are going into part 3 of church history, the 1830 church. This is looking at the periods 1834 to 1838 and also 1838 to 1844. We've divided up into these two periods, really three periods. We did 1830 to 34 first, and we broke that down into two parts just to cover it because that's the most important era, as we've talked about, how the church came under condemnation during that time, how it was established, etc., etc. We've covered that from the kind of 1,000-foot view pretty well, and that's based off of the D&C 101 Parable of Redemption of Zion and D&C 86 Parable of the Wheat and the Tares, as we've gone over hopefully thoroughly enough to make the case that that's how things were, that's what was going on, that's how we got to where we are today, kind of a thing. So what we want to look at is between 1834 and 1838. In fact, maybe I'll just pull this up on the screen to kind of demonstrate the timeline, so to speak. And then I'm going to turn it over to Josh after I do this. The purpose of this, as you notice, isn't to dive into tons of the nitty-gritty of all the different things that happen in church history. It's trying to take more of the 1,000-foot view. And then it's sort of a scaffolding, right? Where it's like, here's the framework of what the scriptures said would happen. And then everything that we try and look at as we're studying church history, if we're going to believe those scriptures, then my idea, and I think our idea that Josh and I share, our idea is that we can then try and see where the things in church history fit into that framework. And if it doesn't seem to fit, then a couple of things might be true, right? Where maybe that isn't exactly what happened. We need to explore that a little bit more, explore the sources from church history a little bit more, or maybe we're looking at it the wrong way. And you could even say a third piece, which is connected to that second piece, that we don't have enough information, which would make it so that we're looking at it the wrong way, right? But thinking of those three views, am I missing a view there, Josh, in terms of kind of using the framework of the parable of redemption of Zion and the parable of the wheat and the tares?
Sounds good to me.
Then let me share this screen to try and kind of create this timeline. Now, it's not a perfect timeline, but we're gonna go 1830 when the church is officially established. Technically, we could come back to 1829 where it's unofficially established, the Church of Christ. And then we're going to take it all the way to Joseph's death, 1844. Okay. And then what we're going to do is just create some mile markers along the way. Right. So we got about 10 years here. We got to 1834. And then 1838. So these mile markers right here, this is the Church of Christ, and that was the name of the church. Okay, and then we go into, I'm actually going to mark here 1832, which is the condemnation. Keep in mind. So I'm a very visual person, and I've often been told I have an incredible ability to remember dates and things. I don't know if I'm that above average, but I definitely use this in my brain. Like I see all this stuff in my brain, and so it's easier for my brain to kind of track dates and what happened and how to visualize it. So I don't know if I'm suggesting it as a mnemonic device for anybody else. So here is where we get changed to Church of the Latter-day Saints. Okay, whoops. Church of, now it's important for those watching, if you haven't seen our previous ones, that this isn't the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. That revelation that mentions that full name is actually what happens here in 1838, is the revelation where it says, "For thus shall my church be called in the last days, even the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints." Now, on this Doctrine of Christ YouTube channel, if this is the channel you're watching from, there is a video called History of the Name Changes of the Church, which I did about 4 years ago. History of the Name Changes of the Church, where I go more into that piece. We're not focusing so much on that, but I'm just pointing it out because there is some nuance here. There's some nuance. Once we get to 1838, we start getting references to the Church of Latter-day Saints. We get references to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We get references to the Church of Christ of Latter-day Saints. So I'm, just for the sake of it, I'm going to put the long name Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, simply because that's when the revelation was given and that name was starting to be used. Whoops, revelation, how do we spell it correctly? Okay, there we go. So now we've got it visual. Thanks for walking me through that. If it's first time people seeing that, they're not going to mind. Those who already knew it, it was probably painstaking to see all that. Okay, now that we've got this visual, now we can pull it up here in a moment that we're chatting to make reference. We want to start about this period where Kirtland and Missouri simultaneously, and then we have this big event in 1838, which is when a bunch of people leave the church. So we want to kind of talk about this. And I will just put one more little tick in here, Josh, and that's the Kirtland Temple dedicated, March of 1836.
Yeah. Put in Nauvoo founding is 39 for reference.
Yeah, so they're in Nauvoo in 1838, but they haven't founded it yet because they're building it and they're calling it
Right.
Quincy or whatever. Anyway, so Nauvoo is officially established as a city in 39.
Yep.
1839 Nauvoo, a little sloppy 8 there. And then, okay, so then we have that. And then, of course, right here in between, Kirtland, 1837 was the Kirtland Safety Society. What is it called?
Yeah.
The Kirtland Safety Society, wasn't it?
I believe so, yeah.
KSS. So the KSS right there in 1837, that's kind of when that happened. So we see these little markers, and there's more that we could put here because there's more weeds we get into on exactly what happened, how it happened, blah, 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 blah. But what we're interested in for this discussion is the why it happened, the scaffolding, the framework. That's what we're trying to answer, because we've put forth these two parables that we strongly believe is the why everything happened, and also kind of the how, a little bit of the how, a lot of the why, but not tons of the what on the granular, but the what on the 1,000-foot, which is these servants were sent to establish this vineyard. There was a level of slothfulness and infighting and amongst the servants. They were at variance with each other, so I'd call that infighting. They were at variance with each other, and then at some point while they were at this stage of variance, enemy comes by night, which is this idea of like being cloaked or unseen, because it's obviously not literally during night in real life, and takes over, scatters the servants, breaks down everything that they did, and kind of establishes their own thing, right? So now we're going to look at this and kind of put it in that framework, especially focusing on these 4 years. We've already talked a little bit between 1834, 1836, the Kirtland Temple, etc. Instead of all the weeds, we can definitely talk about that, but the 1,000-foot view of what was really going on, because what happens 1838, we got all these servants leaving, all these really, really good servants, right? And so I'd like to turn over to you, Josh, to kind of talk about it, give kind of your take and kind of how you see it, and what things stick out to you that you find fascinating about this particular period and the blow up, that we might call it the blow up of 1838.
Yeah. The first thing that I want to point out on this is having having the timeline right, and having an understanding of what things happened in what year really brings into focus a lot of things if you start looking up dates and putting them into the framework. So go ahead and keep that up, Dustin.
Yeah, I'm I'm making it so it doesn't fall asleep on us,
Okay.
because that was being annoying. It just barely did that, and I'm like, okay, let's change that.
I'm actually going to,
Okay, here it is, back up.
yeah. And kind of where I actually want to start, I'm going to pull up my screen for a minute.
Yeah, that's all right. Go ahead and do that.
Let's see if I can figure out how to do it.
I guess it'd be worth marking on here that 1834. I mean, I put Church of Latter-day Saints, but that's when it actually happened. Obviously, it's 1834. Hopefully, that's obvious to those watching.
Okay, I keep hitting the wrong button. Sorry. It's coming.
It wanted to pop up for a second there.
There we go. There we go.
So, okay, section 35.
Yeah, we're going to talk about Sydney here for a second to kind of create a little more context on the timeline.
Okay, so, yeah, and I'm glad you are, because Sydney's an important piece, I think, to talk about.
Yeah. So first of all, there are eras or waves of people coming into the church, and so I divide that generally into 4 categories. There's the first generation is Joseph and Emma. It's the Smith family. It's the Friends. So Oliver Cowdery would be part of that group, and the Whitmers. Well, I'm trying to think of some of the other early names. These are the people that had gathered
Oliver
around
Cowdery,
Joseph.
Obviously.
Yeah, Oliver Cowdery, Martin Harris. And so these are the people that had been drawn very early into a very small private group, really. I mean, the persecutions that followed Joseph Smith happened early on, so that's getting around, and it's not like nobody knew about Joseph Smith, but there's no church until 1830 because there's no Book of Mormon completed. And so the group that develops around Joseph that's ready to be baptized after the church is organized is what we'd call the first generation. And then we have Samuel Smith. The moment the first group of Book of Mormons are ready, literally grabbing him off the table, putting him in his bag, and running off to start sharing the Book of Mormon. And so the missionary work that begins after 1830 is the second generation or the second wave. Now this is where we come in. Sydney's baptism date is November 14th, 1830. And so the first wave of baptisms are beginning after April 6, 1830, because that's when the church is organized, right? And so Sydney coming in November is a very early entry as far as the organization of the church goes, but it's not right at the cusp. Sydney wasn't in that initial embryo group that was around Joseph, but he comes in really quickly once the church is established and the Book of Mormon is published, which is really interesting in the timeline. Now, as we look at section 35, this is revelation given on December 7th, 1830. So this is 3 weeks after Sydney has been baptized. And we get, really fascinating statements here from the Lord in the context of the timeline. Verily I say unto my servant Sydney, I have looked upon thee and thy works, and I've heard thy prayers and prepared thee for a greater work. So what's interesting is that Sydney was already doing a work, and that's going to be made clear here in a second. And his entry into the church, this revelation that comes 3 weeks after his baptism, the Lord tells him, I'm preparing you for something greater than you've already done. Now, what Sydney had already done is actually really significant. We'll talk about that in just a second. Let's read a couple of more verses. Thou art blessed, for thou shalt do great things. Behold, thou wast sent forth even as a John to prepare the way before me, and before Elijah should come, and thou knewest it not. Thou didst baptize by water unto repentance, but they received not the Holy Ghost. But now I give unto thee a commandment that thou shalt baptize by water, and they shall receive the Holy Ghost by the laying on of hands, even as the prophets of old. So, what we're seeing in these first few verses is the recognition of the work that Sidney had already done as a preparer of the way, or as a John. And as we understand, John in the New Testament was doing, he was preaching the gospel, he was baptizing with water. That's why we call him John the Baptist, before Christ began his ministry. And so by the time Christ appears, there is a large group that have been working with John, that have been prepared and are ready to take advantage of the fact that the Savior's going to be there. Now, how long does the Savior's ministry last before the crucifixion? Just 3 years, right? And so that's not a lot of time for Christ to appear with zero preparation and nobody ready to hear what he has to say. Does that make sense? He's going to be gone in 3 years. And so the group that had been working with John the Baptist several years prior are ready to hear what the Savior, has to say, or ready to witness what he does and support that because of the work that John did. Now, as we're considering Sidney Rigdon and the timeline of the early church, we have this, Joseph and friends and family in embryo. They're trying to get the translation done. They're dealing with a lot of life problems. They're moving around, trying to figure out how to keep a roof over their heads, pay their bills, hiding the brass or the gold plates, and trying to figure out how to get it published. This is a very, again, it's an intimate group. I kind of want to use that word, small group, that are really devoted to getting a couple of things done, get to that point where the 1830 church, well, the church can be formally organized in 1830 after the publishing of the Book of Mormon in 1829. So now Sidney is off. He is what we refer to as a Campbellite preacher, or he was he was one of the main people in the Campbellite movement, which was a movement that believed in the concept of the New Testament church. And as they saw it, the keys of the New Testament church were faith, repentance, baptism, and then receiving the Holy Ghost. And so that was the focus of Sidney Rigdon's preaching and gathering and preparing. Now, what's fascinating is, so Sidney comes in 1830, end of 1830, and throughout the history of the church, he is responsible. There's a wave of people that follow him into the church. And Sidney, the Campbellites who joined the church, who had all been influenced by Sidney, number about 2,000 people. And that's about 10% of the total membership up through 44. Sidney Rigdon was single-handedly responsible for preparing 10% of anybody who had anything to do with the church. And a lot of those 2,000 are coming in really early on after the organization of the church, after Sidney's baptism in November 14. There's a bunch of his former followers coming into the church as well. So that's the second generation of people coming in, is the initial missionary work done by Samuel, the Smith family, and the efforts of Joseph, Oliver, David, and the Whitmers, and so forth. Sidney comes in, and then we have the second wave of Sidney followers. And again, from the perspective of our timeline,
or a second wave of converts that are the Sidney followers. That's what you mean, right?
Yes, that's what I mean. Let me take this down, put this up. So, first generation is basically prior to 1830, getting baptized right as the church is organized.
Okay,
second wave.
So we're talking about first gen back here. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Second wave, it comes in right there in 1830, 1831.
Yeah, and so in these 2 years, it's back to back. These two waves or generations of new
Yeah.
converts.
Now,
Oh,
a critical
first.
point here is that the Lord gives warnings throughout 1830, 1831, 1832. In 1832, section 84, we have the most prominent of the warnings. Well, in fact, the most prominent because the church goes from being warned to being condemned,
Right.
collectively speaking. So, in just the 2 years, actually, it's less than 2 years. Let's get the exact.
It's fall of 1832, so it's technically 2.5 years after the official organization.
Well, organization is in. Okay, so April of 1830
It's about October,
to
I think,
September
or
of
September.
32.
Yeah, the fall.
So
Yeah,
yeah, we're
September.
looking at 2 years and change, a few months. April through September would be
4 to 5 months, somewhere there.
4 to 5 months. Yeah. So 2 months, 4 years after the organization of the church, the church is now officially under condemnation via Section 84. And so the major point to understand here in terms of church history and timeline is that basically the people around Joseph and the people around Sydney, and a few other converts coming in from the first year of missionary work, that more or less was the church that was gathered. And in 1832, the Lord says, well, you guys could have had Zion even now if you had kept my commandments, but you haven't been taking what you received seriously, so now you're under condemnation. So the significance of this is that there's, with that initial gathering between, again, the group around Joseph and primarily the group around Sydney, that was the church that could have created Zion. From 32 onward, we're seeing a slew of problems start to enter in. First of all, talking about problems, we have a wave of third generation converts coming in, and the third generation is conceptualized as the infiltrators. Brigham Young comes in April 14 of 1832. Heber C. Kimball comes in April 16 of 32. John Taylor is coming in May 1836. Willard Richards, 1836. Lorenzo Snow, 1836. William Law, 1837. So, looking at the baptism dates of the key people coming in, particularly I picked out Brigham, Heber, John Taylor, Willard Richards, Lorenzo Snow. These are all Brighamites. These are all the if you grow up LDS, the kind of like the biggest people in church history besides Joseph, it's Brigham, it's Heber, John Taylor, Willard Richards, Lorenzo Snow, and the idea here is that those guys they weren't even the second generation. They weren't even the people who were prepared by Sydney, let alone the people around Joseph. They all have an entrance coming in later and later. We also have the 1831 warning where the Lord says there is a group meeting in secret chambers right now, planning your destruction in process of time. Paraphrased. That's in 31. In April, and then April 14, 1832, Brigham and Heber get baptized. And for me, this is the fulfillment of this warning coming in, where, however it worked behind the scenes, Brigham and Heber are the agents of that secret chamber. And
which reminds me of this phrase that these tares were planted early on. We have this phrase from 86, while the blade is yet tender, right?
Yeah.
Which is, we're looking at the timeline. It's like, well, 1832, these guys are already coming in.
Yeah.
When we talk in different circles, some people like to argue, when did people like Brigham and Heber exactly, when did they exactly decide to start doing what they did? Was it when they came in? Was it before they came in? Was it way over here? Like, was it while Brigham was introduced to the Cochranites? Which, by the way, we have an interesting comment here from John, that between 1832 and 34 we get some Cochranite converts, which is true, and that's an interesting piece of information if we dive into the weeds of stuff that happened. And so it is a conversation, but regardless, these are the people that end up overthrowing and taking over the church once we get over here to 1844, and when we start looking into this era, if we get time today to go into that, if we have to save it for next week, and notice that it's way back here. It's not like they show up here and start taking over or something. It's right here while the church is tender, while the blades are tender. And as the parable of the redemption of Zion says, while they were laying the foundation thereof. So while they're laying the foundation right here, boom, we have these issues.
Yeah, the foundation gets laid, which is completed in the Book of Mormon being finished and published in 29, the church being founded in 30. I would say the foundation proper is the word of the Lord being published. The organization of the church formally is now supposed to be Zion. When you organize that church and you're baptizing with authority, that's supposed to be,
it's supposed to be the immediate fruit of it.
Yes, synonymous with Zion, more or less. I mean, the church is the ecclesiastical spiritual wing of Zion, whereas Zion itself is a political entity, a kingdom. But they were supposed, they occur simultaneously, or they're supposed to. And so 1830, technically, the kingdom is established. And then in 32, the reprimand coming in is, well, you didn't actually establish it, and yet you've been claiming to have established it, and you've been using authority that I gave you, and yet you're not actually doing it. So the Lord isn't going to allow the authority to be there very long if they're not actually representing the kingdom properly. And so that condemnation is, it comes in super fast while the blade is yet tender. They're just barely getting going, and meetings are taking place in secret chambers simultaneous to this, to the beginning of the founding. And then we see, like I say, for me, in retrospect, Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball are, I think, the leaders of the infiltration. And so we understand from Brigham's history, he had access to the Book of Mormon, what was it, like a year or even 2 years? He had it, and that's the story, right? He read it and he really thought about it and made sure he was totally ready when he got baptized. So Brigham actually was tracking, if that story is true, Brigham was tracking the early movement, but he waits something like 2 years before getting baptized. And again, from the perspective of the martyrdom, polygamy, changing the law of tithing, all the stuff, the Brigham Young's coup and usurpation of the movement, he definitely appears. He and Heber seem to be the lead infiltrators. And again, a lot of the key people around them moving forward, had come in after them. There's a couple of exceptions. The Pratt brothers came in very early on in 1830, and Bill Whitney came in 1830. So it's not. I'm gonna check the mail. Sorry, you hear that?
Well, I already checked the mail.
Okay. Sorry, say it again.
So I'm getting audio coming in. Not sure. Was it on your side?
Oh, maybe it was. I was trying to mess with the mic here. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Okay, so anyway, there are some early baptisms that end up becoming Brighamites, which is another interesting conversation. The Pratt brothers are one of the most notable. They came in 1830, so they were
Along with
really,
Orson Hyde. Yeah.
yeah. Um, so you have to, and anyway, so that's where I would say, okay, if they're coming in 1830 prior to Brigham Young, they're not originally associated with Brigham. And it kind of looks like they probably were authentically drawn to the movement, read the Book of Mormon, thought it was great. But we then see possibly they get seduced or corrupted into following Brigham as the years go by and things start to break down.
Right.
And okay.
Yeah, that's something I think about too. And obviously, like I said, we're not trying to get too much into the weeds here, but it's worth talking about some of the details. And people watching these are going to have various levels of familiarity with church history, with names. And our intention isn't to necessarily get too boggy in it, but we want to do just enough that we're being specific, but also don't want to offend people that know a lot. And it's kind of like when you're in a beginning physics class and you have some advanced physics people in there and they get really bothered with how the science gets simplified by the teacher because the teacher has to simplify it for the beginning students. They're like, that's not how it actually works. Actually, it works like this. So we're not trying to do that here. We're not trying to get super specific, but we do want to point out enough details. So as you're mentioning, I was going to read some of the names and you already mentioned it. So people like Orson Hyde and the Pratts, they show signs of good fruit early on, being servants, and as most of these Sidney Rigdon congregation conference do. And so just because anyone ended up going with Brigham or participating in polygamy doesn't necessarily mean, Newell K. Whitney's another one, right?
Mm-hmm.
Lyman White's another one. Zebedee Coltrane, John Corll, John Corll was part of this earlier crowd that left that we'll talk about. But we have these people that seem to be part of this undercurrent of secret combination that ends up taking over and leading the church afterwards. And it's a little difficult to always say who was scheming and who was joining the team, maybe ignorantly or maybe foolishly. And we're not necessarily trying to name all names, but there's definitely some schemers, right? And that's kind of the point that we're talking about. We have some definite schemers. We have people that seem to be going along with them to one degree or another, and people have different opinions on that, and that's okay. But the point is that we see this underlying current of just things starting to fall apart, right? As we have these waves of converts, now we get in past this condemnation point, and then we have this big mile marker of, okay, now we're changing the name. And then we still have a really awesome experience here. This is a powerful one. Kirtland Temple dedication. Lots of people receiving the baptism of fire and Holy Ghost there. But it isn't the whole church. It's just this group of people that's there at the temple, which is not even close to the whole church. But that's not how we're told in history. So if you're just reading church history out of our Sunday school manuals, then it gives the impression that this was the Lord's sanction on the entire body of all the saints. And that's kind of how it reads from our church manuals, right? And that's not really the truth about what happened here. That when you follow the history, there was select elders and members of the church that were called to be here, to be prepared to receive their endowment from on high, the endowment of power. The endowment of power is the power and gift of the Holy Ghost from God. And so they were selected to be there. Not everyone could be there. And they did a couple of sessions and they were all really powerful, but it was not even close to being the whole church. We still had tons of people in Missouri, for example, and other people that were even in Kirtland not there. So that's an important distinction, that even though this was a really amazing moment in the history, spiritually speaking, and it was a high point for many, that many has an asterisk where it's like, well, but it's still a small percentage overall, especially as things continue down the line here, even more especially when we just look shortly down the line, where just within 2 years of this moment, we reach this it's a watershed moment, because this is that moment when I knew that these people left there, but when you put it into this context of, we have this wheat group, they're the hardy good souls, the good servants that all seem to leave right around here.
Uh-huh.
And
Yeah,
it's like, what the heck?
they all come in for the most part, 1830, 1831.
Yeah, right through
And
here.
the temple lot in Missouri is dedicated in 1831. Again, right, like very early on. And we have Kirtland happening. So Missouri and Kirtland are happening basically simultaneously, right?
Right. Yeah,
And
Kirtland's obviously established first, but Missouri, they're going to Missouri pretty soon after, and they're pretty much simultaneous throughout here.
yeah, Kirtland was kind of the center of operations prior to getting organized, and then in the sense of getting organized to build Zion. So they're in Kirtland. They get the Book of Mormon translated. They establish the church, and Kirtland kind of becomes a center point for all of that stuff. But in 31, they're off to Missouri to dedicate the temple lot and to get Zion going. So you've got two stakes or two branches or two churches, even if you want to call it that. You have Kirtland and Missouri. And now the Kirtland group is going pretty good. They kind of go through this ebb and flow of having problems but repenting, and we get to 1836 where the Kirtland Temple dedication, a real achievement, many receiving heavenly manifestations, witnesses, gift of the Holy Ghost, are what we suppose are going on there. And then we have, and that's about the height of it all. We have problems that have been brewing in Missouri, and they get warned too, right? As what is that? Early on, 1832, 1833, the letter that's sent off to, is it Newell K. Whitney? Basically explaining the revelation given in section 84, condemnation of the church, stuff they got to do. So we see the Kirtland group is doing all right.
Yeah.
The Missouri group is having a little bit harder time. They were trying to do law of consecration stuff. They're trying to actually establish lots in Zion and inheritances, and so they're actually having trouble pretty fast. Whereas, and I don't have all the historical details. I want to say Joseph was spending more time in Kirtland, and relying on key people to head up the movement in Missouri. I could be wrong on that. That's kind of how I've thought of it. But there is some kind of separation between these two groups. Missouri's struggling a little more, a little earlier on, but things are holding in there up through 36, more or less in both places. Then 1837, we have the collapse of the Kirtland Safety Society, which was probably the beginning of the end. A lot of people lost money in that. It's a whole study unto itself. But basically, they set it up in 36, along with the establishing of the temple and the community that's really starting to take place. They come up with their own bank, basically. And then Joseph warns them, this thing is not being managed according to true principles. He pulls out before the collapse, and then it collapses, and then everybody's pissed at Joseph because he didn't personally lose in it because he warned everybody and pulled out. Anyway, it created a lot of bad feelings. So in 37, Kirtland is going down in flames, and then the Missouri persecutions pick up in earnest in 1838. So right there, 37, 38, Kirtland and Missouri are both going down. And we're just now from Brigham onward, as far as an infiltration is going, earliest part of that infiltration coming in 32. And within 5 to 6 years, basically both communities have crashed and burned. And we have major fallout now with Martin Harris, Oliver Cowdery, David Whitmer, a lot of the early guys who were very key initially, have now become divided from Joseph. And
Right.
as far as history goes, they look to be faithful. They're faithful to their testimony of the Book of Mormon. Um, Oliver comes back later with, I was wrong, Joseph was legit. David doesn't quite get that far, but he hangs on to his testimony of the Book of Mormon. But kind of, like I say, that's kind of the end of the church right there. They lost their name in 34, and in 38, a lot of the original people are now pulling out. Things are crumbling, and we have Joseph and Hiram coming in for a final push. Hiram becomes the official prophet. Do you know what year that happens?
41.
41. So there's
Oh, sorry. Well, so 41, he's designated as prophet seer and revelator. When he becomes the prophet, it's actually 43, August of 43-ish.
Okay. Well, so there's a major reorganization moving into the Nauvoo period. We've lost a lot of the original movers and shakers, and we're trying to rebuild now from the failures of Missouri and Kirtland. But and I don't know, it's not your purpose to get too much into the Nauvoo era today, right, Dustin? But
well, I mean, no, it's worth. Well, no, I think. We'll see. We're 248. I think we have time then. I think we should probably, because essentially we wanted to distinguish between these two eras and kind of what happened, and even though we could get into more weeds of the different what's on the ground level happened, we are essentially covering what happened. So I think we definitely have time to say, let's talk about both eras today.
Okay.
Because it looks like we have plenty of time. So I don't think it's a bad idea to kind of go into there and talk about it.
Yeah.
But I will say before we get too deep into this era, I do want to just make a couple more comments about some of the weed specific things of some of these servants falling away and some of the infighting, just to give people a little bit more to go look at. But if you want to make reference to this, that's fine too.
Well, all I want to say there is there's a reorganization going on post 1838, where we have both the first two communities collapsing more or less. I mean, think about it. To the extent that they've got to go make a new town. Missouri's not viable. Kirtland's not viable. Why? I mean, why not just stay in Kirtland and keep going and like redo it? So whatever the fallout, it was so bad. They're like, okay, we just got to pick a brand new place physically, geographically, and then try to get everybody together right there. And so, okay, so that's the point I want to make. So now go back a little bit and let's drop in some of the details.
Yeah, and it's not too many. It's just we have that part in the parable of the servants being at variance with each other, and there's going to be different opinions from different listeners, and that's okay. But we're here to kind of proffer our opinion right now up front, and then as the YouTube channel grows, we're definitely interested in trying to bring in some other takes from some of the other factions of the restoration branches that broke off, or whatever, or whatever you want to call it, splintered.
One thing I want to add right here in the transition between Church of the LDS and then Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, with a lot of those original leaders pulling out, we see that the Brighamites get installed in their place. And so, again, a lot of them are only just barely coming in, like Willard Richards in 36, William Law in 37, Lorenzo Snow's in 36, John Taylor's in 36. So I think in this, if you kind of look at this with your tinfoil hat, they begin in earnest, things are good, but then they start having trouble. By 34, they've lost their status. Again, that early infiltration coming in 32. Now the Church of the LDS era of Kirtland and Missouri, you have, again, the leaders in place are predominantly what appear to be sincere people. Some of them are better than others, but they seem to have all come in sincerely. And then, but through the collapse, what goes on in Missouri, what goes on in Kirtland, especially with the Kirtland Safety Society, now you have, I mean, we probably have the most insight with Oliver Cowdery. He gets what would you say, Dustin? He he starts out some real issues, um, or suspicions of Joseph, and there's a real bitter battle that ensues at this time.
Yeah,
Uh,
and I'll mention some of those details because obviously the Curtin Safe Society is a big one for a bunch of these guys, and there's definitely more to the story than the typical traditional Brighamite church version of that, where a lot of it is laid at Joseph's feet and like, well, that's not just the Brighamite version, kind of like the Bushman rough stone rolling approach kind of a thing. There's still more there, especially when we're using the parable of the redemption of Zion as the framework. The nobleman of the vineyard says that servant, that head servant, is a noble and wise steward, faithful steward. He's faithful, he's wise. A faithful steward's a true steward, that he did what he was supposed to. So I struggle with that, especially when you start to look at more of the source material. Now, that's something that is big over at Hemlock Knots YouTube channel and Facebook group. It's about source material. Let's stop just pushing narratives. Obviously, we're pushing a narrative right here, and we are. And that's, this channel is meant to push narratives. But when you're trying to get down to the brass tacks on your own, you got to go to actual sources and what things happened. Find the facts and the actual sources from the time, and not what historians have said about what happened, because that's the difference. Right now, we are amateur historians talking about what happened in our spin, and we admit that. But when we look at some of these sources, there's more going on, like Josh mentioned, where the whole country had a major economic collapse and they want to blame Joseph for it. It's like, well, the parable says that it's the variance of the servants that causes the issue, and their lack of spiritual ascension to build that tower. And so it had nothing to do with this Kirtland Safe Society, even though they put the blame on that. We had stuff happening in Missouri too. When you mentioned Oliver Cowdery, the Kirtland Safe Society was one of them, but also he had some complaints where he's kind of being told what to do with his property, etc. His lot that was given to him in Zion, and he wrote a kind of a scathing rebuke letter to Joseph about it, complaining about it. And then some other things I just wanted to point out that happened in Missouri. Once there's a big movement towards Missouri, which then blows up, and then they all exodus out again. Then once they're in Missouri, all these people, there is some infighting going on. There's some rumors. Obviously, the people getting upset at Joseph, and then some of the elders, including Sidney, they start now turning against each other in a way where they start threatening the lives of some of these dissenters that hadn't left the church yet, but they were griping, right? Oliver Cowdery and David Whitmer and other people. And then that's the infighting. That's the variance that I think is so interesting, because when I look at a lot of these documents and the letters and the minutes and things like that of who was saying what, I'm not seeing the names that people are going to be expecting, right? I'm not seeing Brigham Young suggesting this and Heber C. Kimball whispering that. It's the servants that all look like good servants.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're like, gosh,
yeah.
Why are they fighting with each other and threatening each other to the point where they literally drive out this big group, David and John Whitmer with Oliver Cowdery, Martin Harris, and Frederick G. Williams, and a bunch of them, all right, 1838, they're kind of driving them out because they're being threatened with their lives, not by the church officially, but by people in the church, other good servants or seemingly good servants, not people that we're necessarily suspecting as bad guys in any stretch. And although we're told that Sidney was not a great guy from the Brighamite perspective, when you start to look at it, you're like, no, I don't believe that. It looks like Sidney was a real good guy up to the end. Maybe he had some flaws, but he looked like he was trying to be true best he could. And Sidney was against these guys. And so somehow Sidney was turned against these guys to help kind of chase them out. And so that's the infighting that we're talking about when the parable says that they were at variance with each other, and through that variance, the enemy comes in. And so, Josh, talk a little bit about that perspective of that theory from the tinfoil hat perspective. you know.
Well, first of all, we see infiltrators there before that. So I'm going to say the infiltrators didn't have influence initially. They had to work their way up. And so they are staging dissent. They're spreading lies. They're doing stuff behind the scenes that ends up dividing the servants. And so I see this. I put my tinfoil hat on right there. I see the meddling going on where like you we don't really understand. I mean, like there are reasons why Oliver was upset, and you know you can that's probably one of the best stories I think we have is tracking the events around Oliver. But um, we know that Oliver later basically recants all of his gripes and testifies of Joseph Smith. And so what happened? What happened to David Whitmer? What happened to Oliver? What happened to the original servants? So I think as they're trying to set things up, now remember, again, in terms of the framework of the parable, they established the foundation, they had the hedge up, the trees were planted, they didn't have the tower though, they didn't have the spiritual ascension. And so as they're moving into supposedly the kingdom, they aren't yet the children of the kingdom. They're not the fruit, they're not bearing the fruit of what people in the kingdom are supposed to be bearing. So and that's again, that's the essence of the 1832 warning. It's the Lord saying, you guys can't do this if you're not the real deal. But they're trying and they're moving ahead. And so the initial compromise is that they start to fall prey to both the challenges and legitimate pressures of the work that they're undertaking, but that the scale is tipped by people like Brigham and Heber, in my opinion, who are spreading dissent or lies or creating sabotage in the middle of this. I mean, what was going on with the Kirtland Safety Society that caused it to fall? Joseph warns them in, I think, mid-36, it has to be governed by correct principles or it will fall.
Right.
And then shortly thereafter, he divests from the whole thing. Well, why isn't this gathering group of so-called saints or sanctified people, why are they struggling just to operate a bank properly? So I see here that it's not just some people tried and failed. There's got to be hidden reasons in my mind why that, why Missouri goes down and why the Kirtland Safety Society goes down. And then why are the servants are all pointing the finger of blame at each other, not realizing the secret combination that is among them at this point that has set them up to hate each other and to blame each other and to fight at each other. Then we have the exodus of a lot of those early leaders and the installation now of the infiltrators who have positioned themselves to look really good and faithful, look like good replacements for the first generation leadership that just left. Well, that guy's really reliable. That guy's super solid. Let's bring them in. John made a good comment here. I want to bring this in. Here, the Brighamites get a foothold while Smith was imprisoned in Liberty. Polygamy starts to spread. Apostles sent to England, practice polygamy there, bring it back to Nauvoo. Yeah, so this is happening. Let's see, the mission to England is 39, is it not? I want to say yes, 1839, and that's actually
of which piece?
The mission. So the missionary work, like Brigham goes to England.
Yeah, the England. Yeah, the second England tour, 39 to 41, right through here.
Yes, and so, and actually, the converts coming in from that are what we call the fourth wave of membership, which is predominantly, or it's characterized by the converts of the 12 who, I think to a man, are all Brighamite at this point and moving forward. And so that group coming in, that fourth wave, which is we say about 39 onward. That's kind of the era where we say they were joining an organization, but they weren't necessarily converting to Mormonism. But because at this point, the Brighamites are starting to have a dominance in terms of actually controlling things. And Joseph is still in play, and Hiram, but they're not going to be for very much longer, and they are increasingly embattled in what they're doing. And so, so yes, I digress from there. Where was I going with that? So I made my point somewhere in all that, and I'm not sure what
Yeah,
I'm
yeah. Well, that's okay, because I can help steer from here. That's totally fine, because that was all really good stuff. So what we want to basically point out, let me see, let's pull up, I'm going to do some more blue down here, just so the eyes don't get lost in this mess. Okay, so we have this idea that you were saying, we have the establishment of right through, well, just maybe a little earlier. It's like right through here, the secret chamber reference, right?
Yep.
And if you think again from this conspiracy perspective, which is what a secret chamber is for, it's a chamber. A chamber is where they meet, and they're doing it secretly. So conspiracy. The purpose of that is to organize and plan and slowly roll out. And so from that conspiracy perspective, they're rolling stuff out to where by the time we get to here, and they're coming back from England, and of course, for those that have read Ronald Caron's The Exoneration of Emma, Joseph, and Hiram, which I highly recommend. Print version is no longer available, but you can get it for Kindle and read. He's the first one that exposes what happened over here in England with the spiritual wifery and everything. And so there's a different Mormonism being preached in England during that time. So that this huge wave of converts that Josh is talking about, they come into Nauvoo, and now polygamy, it's actually not even called polygamy at the time, it's spiritual wifery. So now spiritual wifery is going rampant, and Joseph and Hiram and Emma, they cannot trace it because it's coming from a secret priesthood, as it was called, which the secret priesthood comes from the secret chamber. And most of the 12 apostles were involved in that. And so at least the 12 apostles that existed here, because we have the organization of the 12 in 1835. Maybe you need to point that out, huh? 1835, we get the 12 with quotes. Now that group of 12, they had some major dissensions during this time period. So they leave, and then they get replaced. And then Patton gets killed, and he's the last one. He's the last replacement before Joseph dies, and he's replaced with Lyman White. And that was right around this exact time here, 1838-39. So then we have this new body of 12, which is majority involved at the secret priesthood, which we argue is the same thing as the secret chamber, and Ron Caron argues that in his book. He does a fantastic job of showing that. And also the most recent episode on the Still Mormon YouTube channel, which dives into detail on some of those spiritual wifery practices going on in England. Those all do a great job of showing this, but essentially the takeover is almost done, to the point where after Joseph's death here, we have this letter from Willard Richards to Brigham Young saying the long anticipated event of 1844 has come to pass. Let me make this big. Let's make this yellow big. The long anticipated event of 1844 has come to pass. Now, someone might read that and say, well, it was just long anticipated in 1844. Okay, well, doesn't matter. Regardless, that makes less sense, honestly. It's this event of 1844 that's long been anticipated. That is more properly read. And it's been anticipated this long because this secret chamber has been preparing for this all this time. And during this Nauvoo era is when we get John Bennett's on scene making a huge mess with spiritual wifery and all sorts of stuff and backstabbing Joseph. But that's more on the surface, and you might see that more as a diversion to what's really going on. Like John C. Bennett gets implanted around here and comes on the scene like a fiery convert, like all pro Mormon, and he becomes mayor of Nauvoo and all that, just a smooth talker. It's just clearly diversion type of stuff because from a secret chamber standpoint, they are staying secret.
Mm-hmm.
Joseph cannot figure out that it's Brigham and Heber heading all this up, and he has no idea about what was going on
Yeah,
here in England.
there are kind of two classes of infiltrators. There are those that become enemies very, very visibly, very quickly. We've got John C. Bennett's probably the best example, but William Law, let's see, the Higbees, who else gets tossed in this group? And so they, if you're Joseph and, all this stuff starts coming up with John C. Bennett being a complete whack job, you got to deal with that fire, right? And so Joseph and whoever is sincere around Joseph, they're trying to deal with the problems at the surface, not and in effect not being able to spend time on questioning people who haven't really misstepped up to this point. So you're like, in the mind of Joseph or Hiram, and this is just speculating, but you're like, oh my gosh, John C. Bennett's doing this and that. William Law is doing this and that. I can't believe it. I'm so grateful that Brigham and John Taylor and like those guys are really stable and faithful, and they're helping right the ship. You're just gonna be glad that they're not going crazy like John C. Bennett is, right? And so this is part of the part of the ploy is that the people who inherit the power after the martyrdom, Joseph does not see them as far as, the historical records that we have, the picture that's painted, these guys aren't really suspected until, near the very end, 43,
Right.
44, at which point they're again the long anticipated moment or event. The jaws are about to clamp down, or the trap's about to be sprung. That's when the real infiltrators start to play their cards, and um, and that's where and Joseph is responding in kind, but like I say, this is right before the martyrdom occurs. So
Yeah, so I'll go back to the screen. Wait, by the way, did I miss any names under the obvious category that you had mentioned? I mean, John Bennett's this huge one because I see him as just a major, major distraction. Just like you see in every classic movie, we need a distraction so that while they're doing that, we can do this. Or while they're paying attention to that, we could do this. You know what I'm saying?
yeah, the Higbees were in
Oh yeah,
there.
the Higbees.
The group that kind of formed around William Law.
Oh yeah, there was a whole group there.
There's a whole group. And Bennett, yeah, Bennett was just this anomaly. I think he was meant to just come in and totally, be so over the top bad. Like the drama of it just was a complete distraction. Then you have the William Law gang that are much more rooted in there and playing their cards a lot better. They come out, very openly anti, um, but they're not the buffoons that John Bennett is. And so Joseph is now rooting out, and William Law, he's so interesting. He's in
Right.
the group that Joseph considers best buds,
Right.
bosom friends, like eternal bonds forever and ever. That's William Law. And so for William Law to now take on the antagonistic position to Joseph, um, the betrayal of that, the shock of that, again, so distracting to Joseph. Like, how could William do this, right? Thus, creating, again, keeping the real infiltrators um, actually secret. Now, was William just used by the real infiltrators, or was he in league with them? I don't know. I kind of have a theory that William actually was just used by them. Um,
Yeah, very possible.
and I think that because William actually sticks with Sidney Rigdon after that and joins the Rigdonite movement.
Oh, that's
And
right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
so I'm like, what the heck is William Law still doing in there? You know, why isn't he going to Utah? So I kind of think William may have just got played really badly. Um, and oh yes, William Clayton, thank you. And there's a number of those guys coming in, like Kingsbury. What's his name? Is one that.
Oh, right,
Um,
and then Eric has Eric Peoples, the secret. He has a question here. Secret people never had the witness that the originals who were pushed out had. That's interesting. Yeah, because we go back here. Let's go back to that screen. So you look at this list of guys here as an example, and then we come back to this point in time that he's talking about, this 1838 exodus of these guys that had some major witnesses: the Whitmers, Oliver Cowdery, Frederick G. Williams.
oh,
Yeah, totally different class of people, spiritually speaking.
yeah. Eric says my comment was a question, not a statement. He's asking a question.
Yeah, well, and I'm confirming that I believe that's true. I mean that I'm if that's your question, I would say
Well,
yes.
at least Eric, again, these people are all coming in later. They weren't there in the 20s and early 30s when a lot of the major stuff was going down. So, I mean, the Kirtland endowment is in 35, and let's see, John Taylor's not even in until 36, and Willard Richards, and Lorenzo Snow, and William Law's coming in 37. So if there was a moment, I mean, you had the first vision, you had the early revelations, you had the publishing of the Book of Mormon, you had again, the formation of the church. Yeah, a lot of these guys, they weren't even around at all.
And there's let's see, let's go back to this slide there.
I would say it's interesting how 36 kind of comes right in the middle of our timeline, more or less. Well, let's see, 29, that's 7 years. Okay, so in terms of years, it's not necessarily right in the middle, but 36 is kind of the high point, and there've already been some losses, but the Kirtland endowment was a pretty big deal. But after that, it's all downhill, significantly downhill. So there's a high point in 36. After that, there's not much to point at that in terms of light, revelation, progress, exciting developments, except a couple revelations that come through Joseph after that point, which are, you know, I would just say they needed to come forth, and they did, but that's the only thing you can really see. I mean, we tend to focus on the Nauvoo era as the what would you say, the golden era of the early church.
Right.
And it so wasn't.
Right.
It was such a mess. And it's characterized the way you've laid this out, the blue and the green and the yellow, or the gold there, the golden era.
Yeah, that was an accident, but it's kind of ironic.
Yeah, is it any wonder that Brigham successfully pulls off, drawing off the largest portion of the church, in 44 and 45? You can see that Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, so-called, really was the product of the secret combination,
Yeah.
more than it was the product of Joseph's work. And Joseph's last dream is a great metaphor for all of this, where he goes into the old barn, realizing how decrepit it's become. And he's kind of in there looking around like, man, what is it going to take to patch this thing back together? When other people start entering the building, claiming this is our barn, and he's like, well, technically it's mine. I mean,
Right.
it's not, and if it's not mine, it belongs to the church. And these figures infiltrating his barn are very, very viciously claiming this is our barn. And from the perspective of this timeline, I would say that that was true. They had conceived of this counterfeit church and had been working very hard to create it, and are telling Joseph in the dream, we built this thing, or at least we've taken it over. It really belongs to us. And that there's a truth in that from the secret combo and corruption point of view. And Joseph's comical reaction is just like, you can have it. I don't even want it at this point.
Yeah, here, let me pull that up real quick just to, because that dream really helps kind of solidify this narrative that we're talking about. I've just got it pulled up here. And this is from the Reluctant Watchman's blog, which I recommend.
And before we dive into that, hold on, I'm going to answer Eric's question. So
go ahead.
Did Joseph ever use the title Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints? So Eric, the name was revealed in Doctrine and Covenants that would be the name of the church. However, as far as my understanding of the original history, they went from a name, the Church of Christ as the name, to the Church of the Latter-day Saints. We can see the official act where that came to be. And to my knowledge, they never went to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Now, Dustin, tell me if I'm wrong.
So there were usages of it. And as I mentioned, here, I'll show you on the screen so you could take a look. Name.
I know that it was revealed and that they were planning to use it, but I feel like by the time they do, Brigham's more or less in charge, and that's the name they run with moving forward with the counterfeit movement. But I don't know if because again, by 39 and 40, there's not a lot left of the church that might have actually brought Zion. Again, we've lost so much of the original leadership to infighting. They've been scattered mostly at this point.
So here, this is the video I'm talking about. It's on the Doctrine of Christ YouTube channel. History behind the name changes to LDS Church. I also have it posted to my own YouTube channel. Yeah, definitely recommend it because I walked through that. There are references made. I mentioned, show some letters and some meeting notes and stuff like that. But it's just interesting to also note that Joseph also used the name Church of the Latter-day Saints in those final years. So the short recap is that there is some ambiguity as to why that name. So what we have here, let me pull up the timeline. Where is it? Where'd it go? I'm sharing multiple screens here. There it is. Okay, so when we're looking at the timeline, and I referenced this is the one reference down here. History of name changes of the LDS Church. So we see that revelation, which is right here, as I mentioned. That's the revelation about the name Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But yet, we have a bunch of references right here at the end of Joseph's life using this name, which is curious. And so we don't know 100% what's going on, but what we do know, and again, shortening just a little bit of the video, we mentioned last week, we kind of showed that right here in 1834, that there was an actual conference held where the name was talked about and voted on, and we have record of that. We have zero record of anything like that happening in any of this era. So we get this revelation here, and it's like, oh, well, we have a revelation. And interestingly, because of our tradition in the Brighamite Church, there's a lot of Brighamite mentality where it's like, well, there didn't need to be a meeting because the Lord revealed it. and anyone that has studied the documents of the history of the church knows that they voted on everything. That was the way they did everything. It was by the voice of the people. And the revelations themselves say that. And I go through that in the video quite carefully. It's just ironic that we have a clear action here that's documented with no apparent revelation in connection to it. Then we have a clear revelation with no clear action connected to it. Mm-hmm. It's just a little ironic to me. And so it's a little bit of a mystery.
And that revelation is given conditionally, that the church will become the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints if they hearken to the word of the Lord. So the Brighamite tradition is to present that, be like, the church was established like this revelation, but it's spoken conditionally. If they follow me, if they do my stuff, the Lord says. I'm paraphrasing badly there, but there's an if there. And so they are not the church unless they are the church. And that's always the principle. You're not a follower of Christ unless you are a follower of Christ. Like, you have to actually do it. And the church, I know that, like, that moment onward, 1839, like, they had this final chance, which is documented in section 124. January 19, 1841 is when section 124 comes out. And this is the last chance. The Lord's like, do these things or I will reject you as a church with all of your debt, is the phrasing. And so here again, they cannot be the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints because they have not regained their status as the Church of Christ. They remain the Church of the Latter-day Saints. Although I would suspect that Brigham and Company, who are now more and more in power, are trying to push the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints narrative, knowing that they're going to continue this thing after they get rid of Joseph. They want to appear to be the real deal that started in 1830 and without any kind of interruption or drama became the LDS Church of today.
And gosh, you know what? I didn't even remember this quote from Emma until while we were chatting, so I didn't have it prepared. It's the one that Brennan Leafty commented about like a year or so ago that you and I chatted about, just like, oh my gosh, this is fantastic because it really lends itself to the story here. Do you remember which one I'm talking about Joseph leaving Nauvoo and the Lord going to bring about the redemption of Zion and possibly find another people, and then Joseph decided to stay. You know what I'm talking about? Does that ring a bell to you? I like texted it to you and said, hey, and then you talked to Brendan about it. Anyway, I wish I had it and I don't. I want to find it, and when I find it, we'll mention it on this broadcast again, because the idea is that what happened right here at the very end, getting down into some of the weeds, is really fascinating. And because we have the parable of redemption of Zion, where Joseph is expecting, or hoping, not expecting, hoping to redeem this people. And last week we read Joseph's letter when he said, if Zion doesn't purify herself, God will seek another people. So, and that was back here in January of 33. So right after the Revelation, 1932, right here in January 33, Joseph said that in the letter, and we read that on the broadcast last week. And over here, we have this statement from Emma about what Joseph was talking about in relation to the redemption of Zion and him leaving Nauvoo, etc. And I really wish we had it. I'll get that so we can talk about it again later because it really ties in nicely to this. Even though we'll be officially done with this episode, we can at least make reference to it. But the barn dream that you made reference to, which I just want to read because it's short, real quick, it also ties in super nicely right here at the very end. And he had this the night before he died, which is what's so fascinating.
Pull this up on the screen. We'll end with this.
Yeah. So we'll end with Joseph's final dream. Now, if you type in Joseph's final dream, you're going to get other dreams like the steamboat dream, which is also fascinating. What's nice about Doug, this is Doug Knighting's blog, The Reluctant Watchman. This one is Joseph's last dreams. He actually includes all of them. At the top of the screen is that it's not showing the top of the screen there, but anyway, it's reluctantwatchman.com/Joseph's last dreams. So the dilapidated barn, Joseph Smith's last dream occurred, boom, night before he died in Carthage. So here it is. I was back in Kirtland, Ohio, and thought I would take a walk out by myself and view my old farm, which I found grown up with weeds and brambles, all sorts of.
And remember the Kirtland era with was kind of the peak, if there ever was one, of the
right, the true golden era.
Yes. And so it's interesting. He finds himself back at that moment where they almost had it, and he's looking at the old farm here. Okay.
And all together bearing evidence of neglect and want of culture, or cultivating, right? Want of culture. I went into the barn, which I found without floor or doors, with the weather boarding off. So interesting, because it's describing the condition of the church that it has become, is what he's doing, and was altogether in keeping with the farm. While I viewed the desolation around me, just to sum it up, and was contemplating how it might be curse upon it. Josh, will you keep reading, because I got the dogs working.
Yeah. So while I viewed the desolation around me and was contemplating how it might be recovered from the curse upon it, there came rushing into the barn a company of furious men who commenced to pick a quarrel with me. The leader of the party ordered me to leave the barn and farm, stating it was none of mine and that I must give up all hope of ever possessing it. I told him the farm was given me by the church, and although I had not had any use of it for some time, isn't that an interesting metaphorical statement? Although I had not had any use from this farm at all for some time.
Right. For some time it's been pretty crappy.
Yeah. Still, I had not sold it yet. So he's still, and again, 1840, 1841, 42, 43, into 44, Joseph is still laboring to save the people, even though in 38, 39, there was a major collapse, and it's just gotten worse since then. So I had not had any use of it for some time back, but I still had not sold it. And according to righteous principles, it belonged to me or the church, which again, according to righteous principles, it was his. According to conspiratorial principles, it belonged to the furious men. He then grew furious and began to rail upon me and threaten me and said it never did belong to me nor the church. I then told him that I did not think it worth contending about, that I had no desire to live upon it in its present state, and if he thought he had a better right, I would not quarrel with him about it, but leave. But my assurance that I would not trouble him at present did not seem to satisfy him, as he seemed determined to quarrel with me and threaten me with... Dustin, can you scroll down? Threaten me with destruction of my body. Interesting, huh?
Yep, exactly. I mean, the metaphors are so obvious. You read this and you're like, come on.
Yeah, I know. Like Joseph, he's like, I'm pretty much done with this at this point, and I'm not even going to contend it with them anymore. They can have the thing. But this man or men, these angry men, aren't content with that. They want to kill him. While he was thus engaged, pouring out his bitter words upon me, a rabble rushed in and nearly filled the barn. This is interesting. So again, we have initially these, I believe it's men, right? Up above, furious men. So there's more than one man that comes in, but there's like a leader among them, or at least a spokesman. And while they're in the midst of this takeover, a rush of rabble come in. So this is the membership, what we would call fourth and fifth wave membership. The rabble coming in are not converted to Mormonism in the sense of what it originally was. That's my take on that anyway. The rabble rushed in and nearly filled the barn, drew out their knives, began to quarrel among themselves for the premises, and for a moment forgot me, at which time I took the opportunity to walk out of the barn, about up to my ankles in mud. When I was a little distance from the barn, I heard them screeching and screaming in a very distressed manner. As it appeared, they had engaged in a general fight with their knives. And while they were thus engaged, the dream or vision ended.
So there's some interesting ways to look at it, applying a lot of these elements to that moment in time or to that span of time, and I'm totally all for that. What's interesting to me is that he's come back to his barn, and it's like it's the state of the barn at the time that he was now dead, and he gets an idea of it. What's more fascinating to me is if you apply it to the return of Joseph Smith, which I personally believe that he's going to return, and we talked about that in the parable of the redemption of Zion. But even if you don't believe he's going to return, if you just put the barn as how the church grew over time, down the length of time, and then this idea of Joseph coming back to it to check on it to see, like, well, how's the church doing since I died? And then when you put it in that perspective, I think it works both ways, just like Doctrine and Covenants does. Where it can work back then, and then it can also work at the end. So it's like this idea of Joseph coming to check on the church in the latter days, and they've long since forgot about Joseph. It's been unkept. It's unrecognizable. It's complete destruction, and all this fighting and ramble to take it over, which goes with our theory of the succession since Gordon B. Hinckley or Ezra Taft Benson, of the presence of the church, and how there seems to be a lot of secret murder that may have been going on, which don't have chance to get into on this episode, or maybe not even on this channel, really, but some interesting more conspiracy theories. Because if they were willing to do it to start the church, why wouldn't they still be willing to do it now? Like, it's the history of all power, where people in power get overtaken by other people that want to become in power. So, but just seeing this infighting of this rabble that's happening with this barn dilapidated, it's so interesting to apply it to both spans of time and see how it applies.
Bringing up a comment from John, the barn is supposed to be used to secure the wheat. Great point, John.
Yeah, I like that point. So anyway, that covers the real Mormonism perspective of church history, trying to give it that scaffolding with the parable of the redemption of Zion and the parable of the wheat and the tares, sections 101, section and 106, or 86, excuse me. And it's really, as Josh mentioned before, 101, 103, 105, because it's a series of 3 revelations that go together. And then also 86, which ties right in like this. And that is meant to hopefully give people the framework to look at all church history through, compare it to that framework, because that's the framework that was given by Revelation. And so we find it helpful, trying to understand what changes were made to the Doctrine and Covenants and why. What was happening with Joseph? Was he really doing what we're thinking he was doing? Are we judging it properly? Are we missing information? Because 101 says that he was a faithful and wise steward all the way to the end. The Revelation does, as a parable. So there we go. Join us. Oh, go ahead, Josh.
Well, and from our premise and platform, if you take away the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and the Covenants, what religion have we left? Or what have we? None. We don't have a religion. The religion of Mormonism is contained in those books rather nicely. And so being very particular and faithful to what's written in the 2 books that is the key to being Mormon, and being a part of the restoration is being very connected with the published revelations of Joseph Smith, including the Book of Mormon, and but not, including the Book of Mormon, but not excluding all the other revelations that are key to understanding. And so, again, that's the platform that we're working from, is that our religion is published in those two works. And for most of our lives, we haven't really understood what they were saying, because we were looking at it through the lens of the Brighamite Church, which, as we've tried to make the case today, never was the original church of 1830.
Yeah. And by the way, Brendan, so awesome. Brendan, thank you. He just got me that quote. I'm trying to pull it up now. So I'm going to read it while I'm trying to get it pulled up. I'm start reading it just because my computer's lagging and being super annoying. So this is from Emma. Now this is quoted by Edmund C. Briggs when he visited Nauvoo in 1856. So he goes. So this isn't that long after Joseph died. This is only 12 years later. This is Edmund Briggs' journal. So he visits Nauvoo, visits Emma, talks to Emma, writes this down, and I'm going to pull it up here. I need to get it. He just sent it to me, so I just need to get it in a way where we can look at it. Okay, fastest way is for me to pull up a Google Doc and just paste it in there. And I said I'd start reading it, but then it popped up, and I was like, okay, let's just get it in there. Okay. Let's make that bigger. All right, here we go. Let's share that. Thanks, guys. Okay, here we go. Is that big enough on the screen? Make it a little bigger. Is that all right?
It's not bad.
He was expecting his death for some time. This is according to Emma. He was expecting his death for some time before he was murdered. About the time he wrote those letters that are in the Book of Covenants, he was promised if he would go and hide from the church until it was cleansed, he should live until he had accomplished his work in the redemption of Zion. And once he left home intending not to return, until the church was sifted and thoroughly cleansed. And we know when that was. It's when he crossed the river.
Mm-hmm.
But his persecutors were stirring up trouble at the time, and his absence provoked some of the brethren to say he had run away, and they called him a coward. And Joseph heard of it, and then he returned and said, I will die before I will be called a coward. He was going to find a place and then send for the family, but when he came back, I felt the worst I ever did in my life. And from that time I looked for him to be killed, and had felt so bad about it, that when he was murdered, I was not taken by surprise, and did not feel so bad as I had for months before. Emma Smith, quoted by Edmund Briggs, A Visit to Nauvoo. So this is a second-hand account, 12 years latent. Well, no, it's not 12 years latent. It's current. It's contemporary. It's 12 years after he died. So it's the 12-year latent recollection. So Emma's recollecting from 12 years, but the journal account is contemporary. He visits her in 56. He journals about it, and she's just recollecting from 15 years. Right. It's powerful to me because it reemphasizes what Joseph said. So it's in line with the parable. It's in line with what Joseph had said, what we read in his own personal letter from 1833, which is that if Zion does not purify herself, God will seek another people. And we see it right here, where what Emma's recollecting, it's all matching. And so this is a very believable recollection from my point of view. Josh, any comments here? I know this is a little extra, but since we've got to talk about it because it's right with the episode.
Well, this is a good cliffhanger actually for like next week. We could expand on this because there's something huge right here. All Joseph had to do was hide or leave. And the promise, I mean, if Emma is faithful in her recounting, um, the kingdom could have gone forward originally. Um, and apparently, it did not because Joseph made a decision to return, and he knew full well what that meant. And so the reason he may have done that is a fascinating question to ask. Um, all
Now, from this account alone, it makes it sound like he just didn't want to be called a coward, which is kind of like the Marty McFly take, like nobody calls me yellow. I'm going to turn around and fight anyone that calls me yellow. And that's kind of the take that seems like this is going, but it's clearly missing your favorite quote that we're aware of.
Yeah, the quote that's attributed to Joseph after he recrosses the river to the east is, "If my life is of no value to my friends, it is of no value to me." And so, and I've tried to track that down. It's attributed to Joseph, but he didn't actually write it down himself, so we have to take it with a grain of salt. But
well, again, but that grain of salt. Now, of course, you look at the sources. Was it contemporary? Was it latent? Secondhand, thirdhand, blah blah blah. But then you also, how much does it actually match the things that Joseph said? Because we have other statements from Joseph that are really in line with that
it is
type
a
of
good
statement.
match. It is a good match. And so what it all hints at is that something really major happened that night on the west side of the Mississippi, where he changed his mind about what he wanted to do. He could have held out. He could have hidden until the church was cleansed. It all could have moved forward because Joseph was the key. He had to be there for it to move forward. And his being removed from the midst of the church was the same thing as Moses being taken out of the midst of the church back in the day.
Right. Right.
There would be hard consequences if Joseph was not around. And why did he change his mind? What happened that night? I mean, we obviously don't have a journal entry about it, but we can kind of read between the lines a lot of the factors that were probably on Joseph's mind. And from these little hints that we get, it had to do with whether or not he would labor with the current generation or he would allow it to be cast off and for the kingdom to come at a different time amongst a different generation.
Well, and let's add another little piece, a little hint that as long as we're typifying Joseph after Moses, which is extremely appropriate because that's exactly what God said. Then we look at Moses' story and why Moses opted to sacrifice being able to see the promised land, the fulfillment of Zion in this case with Joseph, to see the promised land so that God wouldn't destroy all the Israelites that he had worked so hard for.
Yeah, Moses interceded on behalf of Israel. God's like, "Hey, I'm going to destroy them." And Moses is like, well, hold on. What if we labor with them longer, right? That was Moses' intercession.
Yeah.
Well, and Joseph had basically the same opportunity, but took a different route. It appears. Is that how would you agree with how I said that, Dustin?
Yeah, essentially the type is shadow is there where Joseph elected not to be able to see the fulfillment of what he could have seen if he hadn't struck a clear similar bargain with the Lord, where it's like, well, and that starts to break into some other stuff. Like, wait a minute, so they weren't wiped off, but the church still scattered, and that goes back to the parable of the redemption of Zion. I'm believing Joseph's returning. There's a lot there that we can't talk about this episode. We get into in later discussions, but using Moses as that type, you see the similar idea of I would like to preserve my friends if possible and find some way to do it. And if I've sacrificed my life for it, then I'll opt in. So we got the quote. Thank you, Brennan Leafty. And thank you everybody for your comments. Maybe right here, speaking of comments, Eric Peoples, maybe it was not a decision of himself, but an inspired decision where maybe he's like, hey, maybe I should do that. Yeah, and by the way, while you're mentioning that, and Josh kind of maybe inadvertently quoted from Jacob 5 allegory. I sound like he did it unknowingly. The Jacob 5 allegory of the servants, and spare it a little longer, labor with it a little longer, from Jacob 5. And Moses opted in for that. Joseph opted in for that. It matches, and it's beautiful. It's touching, but it's really deep and a lot more to talk about there. And if it intrigues you, then join us for later discussions on this topic. For now, it's probably safe to say we'll wrap up this episode. Join us over on Zoom for after chatter. We can chat more about this. We could chat about whatever else is going on. It's just a great place to mingle and have that kind of after Sunday scripture study chat. So join us over there. We'll see you next time.